Our last speaker today is David Meyer, professor of sociology at University of California, Irvine. He was the founding director of the master's program in public policy there, and the associate director of the Center for the Study of Democracy. David has written Politics of Protest, published by Oxford, co-edited Routing the Opposition, also Social Movements, Identity, Culture, and the State, Social Movements Society, Coalitions and Political Movements, and A Winter of Discontent about the nuclear freeze movement. His articles, his book chapters, literally, they just go on for pages and pages in his CV. But most importantly, I think if you work in social movements, that you know that David Meyer's work has been at the center of the development of the field of social movement and protest research for 25 years. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome David Meyer.
I'm so honored to be here, to be on a panel with Sharon, whose work I've admired for a really, really long time, and who I have been lucky to know for a long time, and Erica, whose work I've admired for a shorter time and only met yesterday. I'm also really grateful to participate in this event. And this is going to sound silly, but to be involved in one of Hank Johnston's projects, because the first time I came to San Diego in my life was 25 years ago at a conference at San Diego State University organized by Hank on culture and social movements. And he was talking, and I thought he was nuts, about starting a journal. And I think it's fair to say that the modal response among the community of social movement scholars was, yeah, okay, fine. And it occurred to me that looking out at you, how many of you have submitted to mobilization? Okay? How many of you read stuff in mobilization? It's not even a big deal anymore that it's a social movements journal. It's just totally taken for granted. And yesterday it occurred to me that not just was he a great scholar and a really nice person and hyper-organized, but he was also a visionary. And you don't realize what visionaries look like when you're near them, when you're in the middle of their visions. And I feel really fortunate to have had this realization 25 years later that Hank is a visionary, and that one of the benefits of being in this field is that he's there too, doing stuff that helps you. So thank you. So now comes the polemic. We operate as citizens as well as academics, and we're in a really special, awful, promising, important time. And we've seen a level of opposition to the new administration that really is different than anything else in American history since at least the Civil War. I meet people and they say, "What do you do?" And I tell them, I'm a sociology professor. What do you study? I study social protest. And they say, must be a great time for you. There's so much going on. People are paying attention to what you do. The airport protests were amazing. And I say, yeah, it's a really great time, except I have to live here also. So there's lots of collective action. Some of it's by established, long-standing groups like the ACLU and Planned Parenthood. Some of it's new groups like the Women's March, Indivisible is a new group. The White Rose is one new group. And this is sort of my little anecdote to start the polemic. The contemporary White Rose is yet another democratic liberal resistance group, has 3 strategies, has a crappy website, which may wind up mattering more than anything else. One is to influence Congress, one is to support public demonstrations, and the third is to create an underground railroad to protect people who are in jeopardy in the new administration and take them to safe places. The historical antecedent is maybe a little more dramatic. The White Rose was an anti-fascist, anti-Hitler campaign that started in Munich in 1942. Hans and Sophie Scholl organized a small group around a philosophy professor, and they started publishing leaflets. And publishing leaflets in those days meant, mimeo machine, and circulating them sometimes by hand, sometimes by mail. Over about 6 months, they produced 6 leaflets. Historians who look at it say, good circulation might have been getting out 100 leaflets across Germany. This is a small campaign. In February 1942, some of the participants started a little graffiti campaign in Munich near the university. And a security guard in the university saw one of the Scholls carrying around some leaflets. They were arrested, summarily executed, and a couple later activists were arrested later, and the executions dragged out a little bit. A couple of them wound up in jail, but it's not a happy story. It's not a story that we'd code as a success, right? I mean, so that's 1943, they're gone. It's also not like there were other resistance campaigns in Germany at the time that were more successful. So when I heard that they were using this as a model, White Rose, I was really confused. And I was trying to think, well, why pick this? Why pick the White Rose? Well, it definitely demonstrates courage against fascism. It definitely IDs the opposition, in this case the Trump administration, as fascist, but it's hard to make a claim that it's a model one wants to emulate, right? I mean, like where people wind up imprisoned, ineffective, or dead. And it's also hard to say it's because they did something wrong. It's not like they had if they had printed the leaflets on a different color of paper, things might have been different. It was a noble, nonviolent campaign that ended in tragedy through no fault of the activists. And it made me think, what are the aspirations of people who engage in collective action now against Trump? Is it influence or is it witness? And if you say nonviolence is the key issue, then maybe you're deciding that witness is more important than influence. And I don't dismiss that or martyrdom. Let me suggest a different question, which is what works? I want to claim that moral victories aren't enough. We want to know as social scientists what matters when, how much, when. And our job as analysts means looking at this open-eyed, looking at the range of activities that take place, and looking at outcomes in a sophisticated and nuanced way. Okay? The impact of nonviolence, the argument I'm going to make, is the wrong question. It represents a futile search for foolproof recipes. It looks at a censored repertoire of contentions. It focuses on episodes rather than the longer stories that define social change. It omits actors involved in the larger social change place, longer stories, temporal editing. And it produces motivated reasoning, which is not what we as social scientists should be doing. Motivated reasoning is when you're looking for an outcome and you find evidence to support that outcome. Okay, the search for magic recipes. There's like when we become social scientists, we think that, or people around us think that you can have an equation that predicts particular outcomes. And the problem with the recipe model is that the context is often more important than the content of what happens. And the focus on recipe means that you're looking less at the kitchen than at the technique and ingredients that you have. Frame and setting matter. And the analogy that I've used all the time, because I lived in New York, is you'd see people selling umbrellas on the street. And sometimes people would be hawking them, sometimes they'd be soft selling them, sometimes they'd be trying to start conversations, sometimes they'd twirl. But the most important most important factor governing how many they sold was whether it was raining or not. It's not the twirl. And I think when you focus on tactics, you're focusing on the twirl. The focus on the twirl or the tactics leads to negative effects. For scholars, it gives us bad answers. And we're scholars, so we care about getting things right. For activists, it gives you bad advice. And it could encourage inappropriate or dangerous or ineffective tactics or just waiting. If you focus on the story of Rosa Parks, for example, what a great and inspiring story, then you have people trying to recreate the moment of dramatic action, decontextualized, disappointed over and over and over again. Alternatively, waiting for that magic moment when everything hits. Either of those things are suboptimal. As example, context, context, context. Last week, a week and a half, a couple of weeks ago, there were anti-corruption protests, the mass demonstrations across Russia. Wow, numbering in the hundreds. Maybe when you added them all up, they were in the thousands. But the risk and context there make those demonstrations take on a totally different contour and totally different risk than similar looking demonstrations in the United States today, where it's relatively safe to go out. Call for nonviolence in difficult situations like Syria, where there was a nonviolent campaign for change started in March of 2011, send people to their own destruction. And it's hard to see that as benign. When nonviolent action it works in concert with other actions by mobilizing others in the context of tolerance, some degree of tolerance, institutional actions and defections. And boy, I love the social science that came before me, not just since Marx, but just this morning. The attractions and affections and effectiveness of nonviolent direct action depends on context, safety, allies, alternatives. The conditions that make sustained resistance possible also make reform possible. And Erica described this as the reverse causality problem, which is a tough nut to crack. But the place where you can grow a successful, strong, big nonviolent campaign is the place that's more likely to have a benign outcome. And like an obvious project is looking at the transitions in East Europe in 1989. I picked that just because it echoes the logo. I mean, it was amazing that the Polish workers were able to anticipate the logo Hank picked for Solidarity. When you look at these noble, inspiring, nonviolent action, civil resistance, living in truth campaigns, you see the tip of an iceberg. This is actually Václav Havel's words. And he said, the social movement campaign is the tip of an iceberg with 9/10 below. Focusing on nonviolent action is not looking at the part really that is looking at the most visible thing, but not necessarily the most interesting, important thing, which is the growth of civil society and infrastructure underneath that makes social change possible. It's not just violent, nonviolent action. Exclusive focus on one set of tactics means misunderstanding success and failure. It's not always the activist's fault that they had bad placards or just couldn't reach enough people. It risks missing opportunity. Occupy the tundra. In a liberal polity, most action is not violent. Violence is generally limited, divorced from broader movements, and it's laden with risk. Growth in violence, mobilization, or nonviolent direct action responds to circumstances, and we do good work by looking at those circumstances seriously. Okay, activists employ limited repertoire of contention, and it's limited by the values and resources they have. This makes sense, right? Activists can do that. Activists can eschew violence or nudity or protest music. And those things are choices that often make sense and we respect them. But as analysts, you can't do that. As analysts, you have to look at everything that's out there to be honest and make sense of how social change takes place. Episodic focus of looking at nonviolence distorts. So this is like my Rosa Parks, one of my Rosa Parks slides from undergraduate social movements. And what do we see there? There's Rosa Parks being booked, not an old lady, maybe tired. There's Jackie Robinson playing on the Brooklyn Dodgers 8 years earlier. Not there is Jackie Robinson being court-martialed for refusing to move to the back of a bus in Fort Hood, Texas, when he was a military officer. I mean, you guys know that story now. Lots of people still don't. But Rosa Parks certainly did. Rosa Parks had attended Highlander, which had been running nonviolence training sessions for years and years and years. And as we've learned, Rosa Parks was far from the only person to take that action. Focus on the episode leaves out the context. When you can do this yourself. If you make a tiny, tiny hole and look through it, even without your glasses, you can see really clearly through that tiny hole, but you're missing most of what's going on. Tahrir Square, I miss some more story. What's neglected when we do focus on episode? The interests of potential supporters, exogenous inspirations and pressures. Okay. Success and failure. Movements are coalitions. Movements are comprised of diverse actors with diverse goals. Vigor, tactics vary over time. The longer story you tell, the more variance you get. Okay. Peace activists. Sometimes they do civil disobedience. Sometimes they just march. What's really possible exists outside the menu of particular tactics. It's dependent upon issue area, interests, resources, opposition goals. The campaign that targets to stop building a mental health center in your neighborhood is more likely to succeed than those with more ambitious goals. Motivated reasoning. When you hire an attorney, you're looking for motivated reasoning. When you hire an attorney, you're looking for someone who's going to make your case as strongly as possible. They're not going to lie. They're not going to make up stuff, but they're going to look for ways to support a particular argument. No matter how rigorously honest we try to be, as citizens, the dice are kind of loaded. We want this stuff to work. We want our heroes to be people like Václav Havel rather than Robert Mugabe. And when we set up a question that juxtaposes a choice like that, we're making life difficult for ourselves. If you take the Egypt example, actually, we had the Egypt example articulated already, so I don't really need to go over it again, but how long a story you tell. If you tell an episode that lasts 3 weeks, it's this massive success for nonviolent action. If you tell a story that's a little longer, the answer's not so unambiguous. When I started my dissertation, my idea was inspired by the Plowshares 8, who protested against nuclear weaponry and spurred, you're the expert on this. that spurred scores of comparable actions by committed religious activists like the Scholls before the website stopped updating them, and then scores after that. And then in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Well, I'm sophisticated enough reader to draw lines making a causal argument there, but that's not really an honest argument, because those outcomes are dependent upon lots of other actions. Okay, now here's my coda and my problem. I've been watching Antifa violence, mostly in the Bay Area. I understand from Erica Chenoweth that violent action has been a tiny, 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 tiny percentage, less than 3%. You told me yesterday. Do you have an update? Or it's still less than 3? 2.7. Okay. Of the resistance that's been going on in the United States. The idea is to make it not safe for fascists to speak, and stop liberal intolerance, property damage, and some violence in Berkeley, some street fighting. I think it's been really a bad thing for people who are opposed to Trump. I think the incidents are used to discredit the Trump opposition in particular and higher education in general. I think it lends visibility and oddly legitimacy to the targets of the violence. So when Bernie Sanders is spending time on TV defending Ann Coulter's right to speak, that's not a win. It's also helped, these people who might properly be pariahs get lots of visibility and support and get big book contracts. Such that it's become, if you have a conservative book to sell and you're organizing your book tour, you're going to call everybody you know at Berkeley to try to get a speaking date there. That's not good. It also creates right-wing violent heroes like Stickman, who beat up people who were trying to shut down, I think, Milo's speaking. Violence, bad. Easy. Where is it? And then I said, well, what about the anti-abortion movement? The anti-abortion movement has been largely, overwhelmingly nonviolent since 1973. But since the 1980s, there have been episodes of horrible violence, including bombings of clinics and assassinations of doctors. And I think the threat is always present for people who are involved in abortion in the United States. A violent campaign, mostly disavowed by anti-abortion activists. But when I think about the outcomes of the campaign, the violent part of the campaign, I know that Planned Parenthood and other clinics that provide abortions spend more on security than they otherwise would. They have a harder time hiring people than they otherwise would. Not just physicians, but also people who work at the front desk because of violence. Reduces the number of providers. It's this bizarre instance where a basic and simple procedure is not routinely taught to everyone who does a residency in OBGYN. Okay. Increases anonymity for patients and practitioners. I'm going to tell you a terrible trick. Look up your local medical center and look at the OBGYN page, and you'll see pictures of most of the physicians under OBGYN, but not everybody's picture. Because the physicians who perform abortions usually keep their pictures hidden. If they have Facebook accounts, they usually have other names. And when they go to parties, they wait for a while before they tell you what their practice is. Well, yeah, I'm a physician. I worry that this reinforces social stigma of abortion, and over time has been an effective add-on for the anti-abortion movement. And boy, it disturbs me to say that. And I want help in sorting out that violent stuff. Okay, what is to be done? Tell longer, more complicated stories. See complexity and diversity within movements. Recognize multiple actors in and around movements. extend the time frame of analysis when we talk about social movements. For academics, I've just done a terrible thing. I've told you to tell longer, more complicated stories. We know where this ends. But I think it's our jobs to complicate and undermine simple stories about political influence, and whenever possible, expand the frame of analysis, expand the scope of our story to tell more about what's happening and put things in a broader context. So that's where I am. Thank you very much.